Romar ran track too. What were you in the 100, Romar?
10-4, 10-4, meet 100 dash.
How about that? See, you didn't even mention that. All right. Yeah. Well, we mentioned Malcolm. Before we get started, Malcolm had a request that any memorials be given to the World Mission Project. And I think we need to make something there. He was a big part of his class, our accompanist and all that. Can we give $100 in his name?
We always run any kind of expenditure out of the finance committee, and then they make a recommendation to the class on the.
Well, the newspaper said, make it out to First Presbyterian Church for the World Mission Project. So my goodness, we can't let that go. Well, Dan's not here. I started walking already. Tony's here. When this is like summer reruns, you get the old guy come in, and so. But we got a pretty good crowd. Maybe it's the Young Lions thing. When Tony asked me a few years back if I would occasionally teach, I said, Tony, I will teach out of the New Testament only. And Dan I told him the same thing. Here's a couple of quotes out of our text today. Chapter 6 in Hebrews is one of the most difficult texts in the New Testaments to understand. And if you see me up here, one of Barclay's commentaries is not going to be far behind. Even William Barclay said, this verse, Hebrews 6-4-8, is one of the most terrible passages in Scripture. Thanks a lot. Okay. But we've got two themes here today. I'll tell some jokes. There's one in particular. A little boy was asked by his Sunday school teachers, we have to be quiet in church. Why? He says, because people are sleeping. And there was another one, a little boy had Sunday school class, and they were talking about it in the back seat about how Wassamajig's wife had looked back and turned to a pillar of salt. Lots. And he said, oh, my mom did that too. He said, what do you mean? He says, she looked back at us in the back seat and turned. I said, what did she turn into? She said, a telephone pole. But my favorite one for today is about a man who passes on and goes to the hereafter. But he had planned on going to heaven, and he was met by Satan at the gates of hell. And he said, whoa, this can't be right. This can't be right. I'm not going to take this. Well, the devil told him, says, you can appeal. It says, as a matter of fact, if you need a lawyer, let us know. We got plenty of them down here. Couldn't let it pass. All right.
Let it pass next time.
Two of our themes today are spiritual maturity and hope, the assurance of hope. Maturity can take many forms. All of us, well, except for maybe Romar, are considered mature. We've aged, we've lived. That's one form of maturity, just going through life. No, he's not one of them either. As we get older, we age. Fruits and vegetables mature. Wines and cheeses mature. All they got to do is keep on going. As we mature, our personal life changes. Our preferences, the things that used to be important are not important. The things we used to like, we've got other things we like. Our bucket lists change. And then there's a spiritual maturity, which is a theme of today. It's personal improvements that are ongoing. It's evolving. Who among us has the same spiritual outlook that we had 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's constantly changing. We're never there. It's not just wishing. It's born out of a foundation, and we're going to talk about that. You ever thought knowledge comes with education, but wisdom comes with time? And that's a shame sometimes. Why you got to get old before you get smart? Spiritual maturity. Well, I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit of this. The book of Hebrews was written primarily to the Jews. And it was telling them that it's time to let go of the law. You got to grow up. You got to get with the program. All right, let me say, the spiritual maturity that we're looking at is a different type of maturity. It is the path over a lifetime. What other perceptions we have changed over our lifetime. Look at it in our lifetime. Race relations, women's rights, computers, medical science, all this stuff. Boston Red Sox even won a World Series. You know, sometimes these things happen. The author of Hebrews is unknown. It was once attributed to Paul, but no longer. It was written during a time of the early church, and there was much persecution of these people. And therefore, it was easier for them to renounce the Christian faith. They were practicing apostasy. Okay, I've got a definition here somewhere. It's basically a giving up of your precepts, of going back to the old. It's the old saying of when the going gets tough, the tough get going. It refers to the clinging or reverting back to the Jewish ways and customs. It is also written to the newly converted Christians. Those who said, yes, they've met the apostles have been with Christ, they've touched Christ. Yeah, I want some of this. I want this. And then the weather changes. The persecution starts and they go back to the law. So it was written not only for the Jews, it was written for the new to be found Christians. Matter of fact, you remember as a kid, you used to hear the parables, and they were so neat. But Jesus makes no bones about it. Those were written for spiritually immature people because they could not grasp the new covenant. They could not grasp the magnitude of Christ and the relationship. The parables were written for the early converts and those who could not understand it. Qualities of spiritual maturity: they focus on the new covenant. They focus on Christ while separating from the law. It's ongoing. The Jewish high priest was the only person who could enter the Holy of Holies. He was the only one who could go behind the curtain. And he could only do that one time a year on the Day of Atonement. There he would confess his own sins and then confess the sins of others and sometimes make sacrifices. He was the only one. But Christ changed all that. He was the high priest forever. Forever, wasn't it, Dave? There's a couple of statements in here, which is what Barclay was referring to, some of them. The author of Hebrews warns his readers how grave their situation is by urging them to give up fundamental questions of faith like keeping the works of the law, baptism, laying on of hands, and even resurrection. Barclay talks about this too, and he says, Let us leave elementary teachings about Christ behind and let us be born onward towards maturity. For we cannot go on laying the foundations all the time and teaching about repentance from dead works and giving information about washings, about the laying on of hands and the resurrection of the dead. God willing, this very thing we will do. This troubled me a lot. I think baptisms are good. But also it has to be accompanied by internal cleansing. It's an outward show. I think the laying on of hands is good. But there were several reasons that people laid on hands. The priest would lay his hand on a goat who was getting ready to get his throat cut. That was a way of passing sins on to the goat. The laying on of hands is also a way of passing a blessing. The laying on of hands is what we do when we install elders. We pass the faith. But Christ didn't want us to stop there. I think what would be better than giving up all that is to build upon it. Build upon it. I remember one of my favorite verses is what Paul said. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. Now I have become a man. I've grown towards spiritual maturity. I am done with childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. For I know in part, now I know in part, then I shall know completely, even as I have been fully known. In the Jewish faith, the law was a disciplinarian. These are the rules. This is what you got to do. If you don't, man, you're in trouble. Well, the laws aren't all bad. But Jesus brought a new law. We didn't have to have coarse punishments and such as that, because Jesus gave us new hope. He taught a new mission. Even in the Hebrews, it said they are crucifying the Son of God again for themselves and are making a mocking show of him. And then later it says Christ has no need, like those Jewish high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for the people, since he did this once and for all when he offered up himself. Now there's a source of hope for you. And you know, the law failed. It never was successful. It couldn't be completed. It couldn't be fulfilled. And cutting an animal's throat did not take away any sins, in my idea. Spiritual maturity. Ed can probably identify with this one. 3 ministers. One says they were having coffee, and one says, we've got the darndest trouble with bats in our steeple. I have tried and tried. We cannot get them out. The second pastor said, we've got hundreds of them, and I've even called an exterminator. They won't go away. Third pastor said, I got no problem with them. I went up in that steeple. I witnessed to them. I baptized them and made them members of the church. Hadn't seen them again. You like that one, Jimmy? Okay. Oh. I got to tell the other one. The definition of a good sermon has a wonderful beginning, and they wrap it up with a wonderful ending, and hopefully those two are real close together. At the end, when Christ died, this has always been important to me. They even bring this out in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The curtain, which could only be passed by the high priest, who died eventually, who had his own sins to confess, when Christ died, that curtain was not only torn, it was ripped from top to bottom. There was no curtain anymore. You didn't have to wait for the one day of the year because Christ was available and is available 24/7. And he's there forever. He didn't die like the high priest. And he told us that nobody comes to the Father except through the Son. Christ can't lie. We never thought about it. They can't tell a lie. He's told us plenty of things, and yet we don't really act like we believe it sometimes. He's told us instructions on how he wants us to live. That's in spiritual maturity, that we abide by that. And yet we don't sometimes. He gave us a promise when he said, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. My Father's house had many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going to prepare a place for you? No, because he cannot lie. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way of the place I am going. Christ is the truth. Spiritual maturity. I don't know if any of y'all remember or heard Laura's sermon last week. It was about the need in the church to be ongoing, regardless of our age. There's always a need. We're never there. And there are other ways that even old guys like us can serve the church and the younger people. She said, and again, we had the term, the common good, the common family of Christ. There is always need within that. So we don't need to look for hope. It's repeated. Every one of us came into this room and sat down in a chair. That chair held us up. It held us up last week. It'll hold us up next week. We know that's going to happen. We have trust. We have the same thing with the Christ and the new covenant. It's there. Christ is without sin, cannot lie, cannot say anything but the truth. He makes promises and he keeps promises. You want more evidence of need to trust? Many of his promises have come true and the remainder will. He gives us his best. He instructs us on what to do, to obey, to follow and trust. Yet we worry. We don't give Christ our best. We dishonor our neighbors. We neglect our fellow man and their needs. We hold anger and bitterness. We value many things more than Christ. We have reason to trust. Maybe you and I and the world are not as spiritually mature as we think we are. And we've got a long ways to go. Look at the world around us. But we've got reason to hope, and we've got a direction to go. Have a good day.
Thank you.